Let me welcome you to the early morning session on financing a just transition, balancing climate action and green development. I can assure you that this is going to be an exciting session with a galaxy of superstars in the domain speaking. Now, it is a fact that humanity is encountering the cost of being myopic, the inherent myopia of pursuing unbridled growth without really acknowledging the costs of growth. Now, this cost of growth has taken the form of the devil incarnate, climate change. Quite naturally, treating it from that perspective of what we call the global commons, there's a global call to creating alternate pathways, alternate development pathways. To avert the catastrophe, we have to radically change and radically switch to a sustainable net zero future. Now, this transition is not easy, but we need to make it fast. This is more so because it's simply the elephant in the room that we are encountering at this point in time. But at the same time, if we have to make it fast, we need to take into consideration the fact that it has to happen in a fair and inclusive way. Large parts of the global south, at this point in time, who are bearing the cost of industrialization and the pursuance of unbridled economic growth of the global north, are essentially the ones who may not have the wherewithal or the bandwidth to make this transition without incurring the cost, the huge economic cost in the form of sacrificing their growth, sacrificing their development aspirations, employment, human capital, and overall economic well-being. So the question is, who will bear this cost? And how can the cost essentially be borne through various financial instruments? Now, this concept of just transition emerged in the US in the 1960s, and this came up when essentially the trade unions in the United States started talking of protesting against the US laws for the statutes that came up to control for air pollution and regulation, but that is going to have a huge social cost in the form of loss in employment. Now, the same thing is actually gained traction as far as this climate debate goes. As far as the global north is concerned, there has now been this movement towards this Occidental degrowth thesis, which talks of retraction from the business as usual ways of looking at economic growth only, but aligning lifestyle with nature. But at the same time, the problem lies elsewhere. Who bears this cost for the global south? This degrowth thesis has emerged as from a particular destination, from a particular source, which have already grown, first of all, a world that is already equitable, where social protection norms are already in place, and where there are cushions when there are certain shocks, like those of the COVID or some kind of a drought or any kind of natural disaster. These are not the conditions which exist as far as the global south is concerned. So the question is, when we talk about just transition, can we only talk in terms of energy transition, or do we take into consideration the very other aspect of adaptation finance as well? Because let's take the case of seeds, the small island developing states. We might think of the net zero by 2050, 2060, or 2070, but the small island developing, some of the small island developing states or the low-lying areas might be underwater by 2030 or 2035, so they have to survive. How do we essentially finance this? So the question is that I might be having my own questions, but let's stick to some of the driving questions for the very initial interventions from the speakers, that what role do investors and banks play in financing a just transition, and how can they align their business practices to this entire vision of just transition? That is question number one. What are the best practices that have evolved globally, including the European Union and other places? And what are the key financial instruments and policy reforms that can be put to place to mobilize such huge amount of financial resources that we need for just transition? So, Abla, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Mr. Moderator, for the introduction on the topic. Let me start the talk about just transition at three levels or in 3 points. First one is the global responsibility. Second one, a very important distinction that we have to make. And the third one is very much on the ground, specific examples related to the banking system and to the businesses. On the first point, we cannot talk about any change in the climate condition, any improvement in the life of people in Africa and in other areas that are affected by the climate deterioration if the international community does not meet its responsibilities, okay? At least their fair share of responsibility by 2025. They have committed to a lot of things and they did not realize them, and it's important that they do, for starters. Otherwise, we are not going anywhere. And I'm talking specifically about what is called the new collective quantified goal for climate finance, which they said that they are going to talk about, and that is going to lead the commitment take the commitment for a floor of 100 billion to higher levels, and that this is going to be in COP29. Okay, that's actually already mentioned. So this first macro level responsibility is essential. So my second point is about the distinction. We have to make a very clear distinction between climate finance and just transition finance. They are quite different. Just transition finance has two goals: to have the shift, that transition to a low carbon economy and leave no one behind. Climate finance is simply talking about the first one and not necessarily achieving the second one. It can happen and it might not happen, okay? And the scary part is that these two are actually dealing with the same financial tools, so it's very easy to fall in the first segment because actually it's easier. Okay, leaving no one behind is tougher. And leaving no one behind with this meaning depends a lot on the nature of the country. So if you're talking about middle income countries in Africa like South Africa, Nigeria, heavily relying on fossil fuels, we are talking about reskilling workers, creating green jobs. Other countries which are poorer, okay, you have to make an entire shift for the communities to be able to meet the new requirements. Just an example. Now, the tickets that are related to the leaving no one behind are usually smaller. You're talking about infrastructure related to communities. You are talking about loans to small projects. SMEs are very relevant here. All right, and this takes me to the third point. What is the role of banks and business in this area? There needs to be, first of all, an ecosystem, okay, to go with the finance in order to really leave no one behind. When we talk about banks, and I'm going to be very specific, banks, when they give a loan to SMEs, the credit officer in the bank looks at a small enterprise just like the same way as he looks at the big enterprise. It's the same steps. And he's evaluated on the value of what he has achieved, which means that they do not understand the culture of the small enterprises and they're not eager to go after them. And what is needed is to have lower interest rates and have incentives in banks that go for the loans that link not just a green project, but that link the green projects with the training of workers, with the social obligations in a real way and not just on paperwork. And we have a great example from Egypt that I will not talk about, but give the title. It's called Your Job Next to Your Home, about factories that are in villages, employing women, cutting on the cost of transportation, and working beautifully on ready-made garments, which is actually not environmentally unfriendly. All right? On the businesses side, this is interesting, and here the lesson comes from the developed world. The core values of about 90 or 100 international companies were changed recently, shortly before the COVID. And what it did is actually revisit the concept of profit maximization. All the time it's profit maximization, your responsibility to shareholders, and then the CSR is this nice, cute thing that you spend some money on in order to improve your image. The new values are incorporating the two together, so the company becomes a purpose-driven company which is achieving a lot of social objectives and environmental objectives, okay, and not just working on the profit. They did that, and it's a new view, and the COVID sort of made it a very conscious decision that they have to go for that. What they did, we can do in our countries as well, and we can encourage everybody to adopt those values.
Thank you, Abla. And thanks for getting into this differentiation between just transition finance and and climate finance as such. Indeed, in fact, they need to be looked at through two different lenses. So, Lucy, let me come to you, especially from the financial markets and the financial institutions perspective.
Thank you very much. I wanted to pick up on some of the points that Abla raised because it's very much in alignment with the way that RMB and FirstRand looks at this in terms of purpose-driven organizations, and the reason that climate change, but particularly the just transition piece as well, has come into the way that we look at this. In terms of, first of all, what banks and what finance houses need to do is they need to be very clear about what they're doing and who they're doing it for. And so in terms of, there's previously perhaps, the shareholders were always considered paramount in driving the kind of behavior that a finance house or any kind of listed company would have. And these days, we're very clear that shareholders and clients are employees, and much more specifically, the broader society of which we are a part are very, very critical. And the impetus to be more inclusive and to be very, very very specific in terms of incorporating climate change and just transition into what we do is, there is a drive from all of these different segments, and specifically the way that we have operationalized this, and this calls on not just the climate change piece, but the imperative to leave no one behind. Climate change is very important, but inclusive growth and productive capital formation is also what we consider to be critical aspects of this, because one cannot pursue climate change in and of itself, because one disregards the implications of that, and we're not actually looking at this problem statement holistically, particularly in countries of the global south, which is where we find ourselves. And so the way that we've sought to look at this is in terms of determining that purpose, in terms of determining the way that we've decided we want to contribute to this global concern, the inclusive growth, productive capital formation, and climate change. We've started to be very, very deliberate in terms of understanding what we need to do, understanding where we are in this. So in terms of balance sheet categorization, what does our loan book, who are we lending to, what does that currently look like, and what do we want it to look like by 2030, so that we know that we are being part of the solution as opposed to part of the problem in terms of the kinds of financial instruments that we're using, in terms of the kinds of projects that we're financing. And often banks will talk specifically about particular financial instrument innovations that they've done in terms of particular financial products. But I think one of the things that banks and finance houses specifically can do, if we take sort of a step back, is fundamentally the financiers are able to change the behavior of not just of effectively how we see value. In many cases, in terms of sort of climate transition, what the negative externalities or the value that should be attributed to an energy project that does not have negative externalities, there isn't a correct value ascribed to that. And so in actually quantifying the value of these projects that have a clean energy component, that have a social justice component, we are actually able to redefine how we see value, how we perceive value. If we can attribute a monetary value to that, we can actually start to crowd in capital and financing to these projects, because it's wonderful if individual banks want to ensure that they're transforming their own balance sheets. But the real value comes in terms of actually the systemic effect of redetermining what is financeable and how we attribute value to the projects that are being financed and the impact that they will have once the project has been complete.
Thank you, Lucy. I think that's a very, very critical point. What you have been talking of is how do we equate the economic rate of return with the social rate of return? And that divergence is essentially causing this kinds of problems that we have. And that is precisely why we find the stepmotherly treatment of many of the MFIs and financial institutions with adaptation financing. Because those are mostly, in fact, have this nature of public goods without perceptible return on investment. Thanks so much. With that, I go to Professor Igor Makarov. Igor, over to you. I presume that you've been talking of some of the experiences, global experiences as well in this domain.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I'm very glad to be here. As Dr. Latif said, just energy transition finance is not just climate finance, and it is much broader. It's not about only greenhouse gas emission reduction, but it is about finding the new development path for communities, for territories, instead of locked in previous path dependence, which is not relevant anymore. In this sense, I think it makes sense to look not only at the best practices of just energy transition, but to look at the best practices of just transitions in general. For example, in my country, when we say transition, in Russia, we usually refer not energy transition, but transition from command and control to private market economy. And after the collapse of the Soviet Union, we got several hundreds of cities and communities which were created, which were built in the Soviet Union in order to provide some productive capacities with labor force. And after these productive capacities became incompetitive after transition to the market economy, so hundreds of thousands of people left without any economic prospects and with necessity to transition for the new reality. And this is a huge experience, and we have a lot of failures, of course. We have a lot of success stories. And the same story is in many Western countries with accelerated globalization. When globalization accelerated, many communities and many cities, again, left specialized in conventional industries, which became incompetitive compared to the same industries abroad. And we have communities in the United States which are something which is shown in movies like Nomadland. And we also have huge experience here. So we have a lot of failures, we have a lot of success stories in just transition, and we have derived lessons from that. What are the lessons? The transition is just and successful, first of all, when the whole system approach is used. When transition is considered not as compensation of losses to those who are affected by transition to something new, but as a means or as an opportunity to find some new competitive advantages. And some bottom-up approach is needed here, some creative approach. We can't use the same recipes for different communities because each community, each region, based on their local knowledge, based on the context, they should form their own new path. And it is a complicated task, but just transition may be efficient only if this approach is used. Secondly, people's dignity should be ensured. It should not be just some technocratic measures like retraining or providing compensations. We should create the new identity, and we should involve people into this identity, and transition may be efficient only if people keep dignity and keep respect to what they do and to where they make this transition. And finally, the third important condition of efficient just transition is the use of public-private partnership. So, of course, public finance is needed to build infrastructure on the one hand, and public finance and the finance of multilateral institutions is needed to catalyze private investments through all the mechanisms that Lucy mentioned, from other mechanisms like co-financing, like different guarantees from the multilateral institutions and so on. And actually this links our discussion on just energy transition to the discussion on sustainable development goals in general, because the major directions of this investment are more or less the same. So it is infrastructure building, it is education, it is urban development, it is social protection, it is access to digital services, and so on and so forth. This is actually the sustainable development in general. Just energy transition is about sustainable development. And yeah, we had a brilliant discussion yesterday about how to involve private sector into sustainable development goals. Yes, as Lucy mentioned, it works only when business considers value as in a different way, as creation of some common value of business itself and the community abroad. When we make transition to stakeholder capitalism, when it works actually. It works when business has long-term time horizons. It works only if business sees the future for a decade or even more. And this means that the role of public sector, the role of the government here is to ensure this long-term future via guarantees, via different financial instruments based on de-risking and based on sharing risks with private sector. Thanks, I will stop here.
Thank you, Igor. Especially enlightening us, you enlightened us with a host of cases and a host of models as well of financing. So I presume at times, success stories, of course, teach us a lot, but failures teach us more. So with that, and without much ado, let me move to Professor Kim. Professor Kim, over to you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to express, first of all, my sincere gratitude to the host institutions for having me in this meaningful forum. Today, I'd like to address my main message in advance first, ahead of explanation in detail. For the government, MDBs, and then policymakers, I'd like to recommend to fasten and accelerate the process of constructing and reshaping multilateral and regional trade rules for green value chains, because it can provide strong incentives to the business society and the private financial institutions moving forward the just transition. I think that the role of the MDBs of governments roughly two things. The first one is, of course, constructing the incentive structures for the private sector to move. And the second one is priming water into the pumping machine. So both regulation and then money, then public sector can move, can change the behavior of the private society. For the business society, I'd like to highlight that new opportunities and new windows is now opening in the business areas of constructing a green database and constructing informational infrastructure, and transparency issues actually in green supply chains, and green trade under the moratorium in zero tariffification on the trade of green goods and services. For the private financial institutions, including banks, private banks, I'd like to emphasize the new opportunities also is opening in the areas of green financing and investment, such as green insurance market, a green bond market under the green taxonomy, including the EU taxonomy as well, and asset management for de-risking and value-added area, based on the rapid green transformation led by international communities and intergovernmental cooperation and agreement. Let me add some more details. Okay, carbon neutrality through the just transition is emerging as one of the key factors to consider in the transition process of the green supply chain. Green supply chains aim to reduce the emissions from the entire supply chain for sustainability in terms of environment, which requires transnational cooperation. So green GVCs are supply systems that minimize pollution, preserve resources, and contribute to achieving carbon neutrality. They are based on the development of technology for low carbonization, resource circulation, and sustainable production of raw materials and energy as well. The key challenges for forming green GVCs is how to secure the transformation of technology, investment, institutions, and infrastructure for green transformation through proper financing while maintaining the industrial competitiveness of each country. Recent multilateral discussions among advanced countries at the G20 and BRICS and other international fora identify decarbonization of GVCs as a crucial area of cooperation. Under the new climate change regime launched by 2020, countries are ramping up efforts to fulfill their NDCs declared in accordance with the Paris Accord. the source of competitiveness in GVC has been shifting from efficiency to carbon competitiveness. The industrial sector is a major emitter of greenhouse gases, accounting for 19.4% of total global emissions in 2019, with the United Arab Emirates, China, and Vietnam producing the highest emission in the sector at about the 31, 32, 33% respectively. India, Japan, and Korea, my country, also exceed the global average respectively at about the 21, 22%. At the same time, the international community has begun to expand the scope of greenhouse gas emission to include emissions from the entire supply chain. Initiatives such as EU's CBAM and Directive on Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence, we call it the CSDD, and the proposal for mandatory disclosure of emissions by all listed companies in the United States indicates the advanced countries are expanding the scope of emissions reduction to include indirect emissions, Scope 2, and Scope 3 as well. In addition, 80% of global companies pursuing carbon neutrality have explicitly included direct and indirect emissions within their management target. In this sense, it is really timely and meaningful that African Development Bank Group has developed a network of relative partners and experts, as well as stakeholders, to produce resources and guidance for member countries and contribute to the bank's external engagement on just transition through a Just Transition initiative. I believe the African countries can be key countries in the formation of a green value chain as a very rapidly growing economies, together with the fast-growing human capitals, a social network, and the natural resources for the green transformation, driving the access of the international communities, economies, and the key trading partners in green value chain. African countries are closely interconnected through African Union and other regional FTA initiatives and are indispensable partners to the outer world. Therefore, cooperation can be made within the countries and beyond the boundaries of each country towards the out of Africa. Driving major changes by oneself all at once is difficult, but realizing small changes gradually together with many others is relatively easier. If we share the successful experience we have achieved through green value initiatives in the past and open our heart to gather wisdom, we can discover the keys to establishing new cooperation and order in a form that the world can conform and trust. I hope a variety of African initiatives through G20 in 2025 and other fora can make decisive points for this process. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Professor Kim. Let me ask this question, because this is something that has been burning in my heart for quite some time, and it flared up after listening to all these presentations. Do you really feel that while we talk of just transition, we simply cannot do away with adaptation, given the fact that you might think of energy transition can happen tomorrow or day after or wherever. But in most cases, look at the net zero targets. It's 2050, 2060, 2070. Now, when we think of, suppose, let's take the example of some of the low-lying areas or the small island developing states. Now, they might not exist till that time. They are slated to essentially move out from the face of this planet by, say, 2030, 2035, 2040. So naturally, they need adaptation. They need to adapt to survive. So under such circumstances, given the fact that 80 to 85% of the portfolio of most of the MFIs, MDBs, and other financial institutions are getting into mitigation projects, can we really entice private sector to get into adaptation funding? There is a market for mitigation, right? How do we create a market for adaptation? So I'd request all the panelists to delve into this question for 2 minutes each.
I think the reason why you're having so many projects on mitigation is because mitigation is well defined, okay, and there is a target that's related to it. So there is something that you're looking at. Adaptation is not well defined, okay, and there is no target for it, so it's lost. So condition number one for you to have anything on adaptation is to have some level of definition, and it's not easy, all right? But to have a target for it so that the entire world looks at it in a different way. That's I think, number one. Number two, in my opinion, I think the loss and damage fund, which is being talked about, and it started in COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, it's very scary, and there are lots of fears that it's going to blur the adaptation. It will be looked at as if it's, compensation for losses, and it would have the attention and focus attention and not have it on adaptation, which is more essential. And that's also a dangerous thing. I think the adaptation projects are going to come from inside the communities more than anything else, more than outside, okay? For them to be less risky, for the private sector to enter and to expect an ROI, it has to be less risky. For less risky, you need two things. You need an ecosystem, okay, that defines the projects well, okay, looking at the grassroots, but defining them properly with institutions, governmental institutions that have enough capacity building to handle this. But then the second thing, there will always be risk, okay, and there is need for de-risking. And I think the responsibility of the world community is to put funds for cutting the risk, not out of charity for African countries and the others, but out of historical responsibility, because they are simply responsible for the mess that we are in. Thank you.
Lucy, what can entice your institution to get into adaptation financing?
Quite frankly, I think it's an imperative, because if one doesn't take into consideration the adaptability piece, we're not actually going to solve the issue at all. So we talk a lot about just transition, but I think we forget that we need to have a sustainable transition as well. And we are not going to have sustainability unless we solve the social component of climate change and the green economy. There's a very well-worn African proverb that says, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. And this is no less relevant in this context. We cannot leave anybody behind. And Abla was talking about the ecosystem, about being very aware of the ecosystem. This is a highly complex issue. We cannot divorce the social component from the green energy and the climate change component. They have to be considered together. There is a social capital piece. There is, in fact, we were talking earlier about the fact that if we're going to take sustainability seriously, we need to start pushing out the term over which we look at profits. We need to have a much longer term mindset, because these things do not happen overnight. There is a huge imperative to do things and to do things fast, but we also have to do them sustainably. So we have to be much more long term in our thinking. And this is completely contrary to the traditional mindset of corporates and particularly banks. So there is a huge mindset happening here in terms of what do we want to look like? What is our social contract with society? And quite frankly, if corporates and particularly finance institutions do not take this seriously and do not think in the long term, they may not be there in the long term. So there's a huge mindset shift that needs to occur.
Great. Igor?
Interacting of private capital to adaptation is really even more complicated than to mitigation, because there are no clear channels of commercialization as for many mitigation projects. But what can be done, I think we should focus at least in the very beginning in the low-hanging fruits. So there are some areas of adaptation where some clear channels of getting returns exist. For example, insurance, and insurance is the top priority in many countries. And the second low-hanging fruit in many countries and in many regions, including my own, concerns projects adaptation projects which are linked to mitigation. For example, in case of Russia, these are projects in forestry, preventing forest fires. It is a means of adaptation on the one hand, but it also prevents emissions to the atmosphere on the other hand. And here, carbon markets may exist and may ensure this return. And I want once again refer to the yesterday's session on attraction of private finance in SDG-related projects. His Excellency, former finance minister, made a very valuable comment that it does not matter actually what CEO says about strategies of company. It's what really matters is to persuade the credit committee. And how to persuade credit committee? We need metrics. We need metrics for adaptation, first of all. We have some metrics for mitigation. They are not very good. They should be developed, but we have some of them. For adaptation, we have nearly no metrics right now. And what we should focus on is to develop these metrics, develop the taxonomies of projects, and so on and so forth. This is the absolute top priority to attract private finance to adaptation. Thanks.
So opportunities are there, no doubt about that. Thank you, Igor. Professor Kim.
I think it's important to think about the risk management. And then I think that then the public sector should play a very vital role to create the de-risking strategy. So they can guarantee the market for the developing new financial instrument. And also, another thing is that there is a big difference actually in level of technology for the mitigation and the other areas as well. So I think that the market for the mitigation performance should be activated as well. So maybe it takes time, but I think that we need to give some time for the adaptation. Thank you.
Okay, so we are almost at the end of this particular session. Many interesting inferences essentially came out. But the questions really remain. But frankly speaking, this is not the time only to ask questions. This is the time for action when we have climate change as the elephant in the room and climate finance falling awfully short of combating such a global force. At this point in time, the annual gap looms, combining adaptation and mitigation finance, the annual gap looms at around 4.5 to 5 trillion US dollar. And to that extent, if this is not made over the years, then this gap is simply going to escalate. And frankly speaking, governmental funding is falling short. The private sector needs to be enticed. It is not only meant for the banks and the MFIs, but also for the private corporations beyond the financial institutions who should be part of this particular game. Whether it is through, suppose, say, creating some kind of climate bond, sustainability bond, or suppose this carbon credit kind of a mechanism, or at the same time, why can't essentially policy and the policy mandates play an important role here? In many cases, it so happens that CSR funds can always be mobilized. If suppose there is some kind of a governmental mandate that 50% of the CSR fund has to get into either adaptation or suppose say loss and damage or suppose a mitigation mode, something like that. So there are options. It is only up to us on how do we essentially get into this game. Now the other problem that essentially lies is also with the entire definition of just transition, which is not uniformly accepted, A. B, the green growth or the green development aspect of things. So if we at all have to juxtapose these two, we also have to acknowledge the trade-off between the two. Yes, we need just transition. We want green growth, but green growth is simply not going to happen tomorrow. And for that, we need mechanisms. We have to give the Global South the time to adjust to this particular change. Otherwise, it's simply going to be as disastrous as it happened in case of many of these developing nations. Just as we encountered this case of Sri Lanka. In fact, they tried to move into organic farming in a phase of 1 year, 6 months or 1 year. And what they found was it is almost tantamount to a food riot. So under such circumstances, just transition is definitely the answer, but the uniform definition is missing all across. And when a definition is missing, finance is going to be a problem. To what projects are we essentially putting the money into? That becomes the crucial question. So in any way, I think there have been a host of options that have been discussed today. And I'd like to thank the fantastic panelists who really deserve a round of applause from the audience.